All right, so welcome to the whiteboard. Now let's jump into this step by step. Okay, so the first part is, you know how many blank, which represents ideal client, right? So the first thing I want you to get on this is that ideal client does not have an S. It's a single person. An ideal client is one individual that you're speaking to. I see way too many people get this wrong, where they either are trying to speak to a group or they've combined multiple people who are very different into one ideal client. As an example, I've had some people say that they work with executives and entrepreneurs. And what that shows me is that they're not looking deep enough into the psychology behind these people, because those two types of people, just think about it, an executive and an entrepreneur, in other words, a business owner, they're going to have very different challenges, different ways of seeing the world, different words that they would use to describe things. So it's really important that you pick the one ideal client that you're called to serve. Okay, so that's the first thing, is pick one. The second thing with this particular step is what we call making sure that it's an egoic label. Okay, an egoic label is basically a word or a series of words that describe your ideal client. That's kind of like a group or a role that they would associate with, right? So as an example, executives, right? Or entrepreneurs, or dog walkers, or moms, or empty nesters, right? Or, kindergarten teachers. I mean, there's just an endless amount of these, right? But the most important thing is that it's specific and it's something that your ideal client would say, I'm a part of that group, all right? So egoic label. So let's start with my example. And my example is, you know how many multi-talented coaches. That's what I would put right here, multi-talented coaches. Now, what you see here is that I have an egoic label with coaches, but I've also added a descriptor. Okay, so multi-talented, I add that on there because it gives you a little more clarity of the specific type of coach that I work with. So it's kind of like I'm drilling down a little bit with that. You might have a descriptor or you might not. It's completely up to you. But as an example of a different kind of descriptor that you might have, let's say you were working with executives, you might say something like high achieving executives or high achieving entrepreneurs. So if you want to add a descriptor, go ahead. It sometimes adds a little more specificity, makes it a little bit more like it's unique to your own ideal client, right? All right, so you know how many multi-talented coaches. And then now we're moving on to number 2, right? Struggle with standing out in an oversaturated marketplace. Okay, so the problem is, the number one problem that my ideal client has is that they are not standing out because it's an oversaturated marketplace. So very specific, and it's also specific language that my ideal client would use. So that's the number one problem. And you might have multiple problems that you perceive your ideal client to have. And your goal right here is to pick the number one, the top one, the one that keeps them up at night, the most urgent, the most painful, the thing that they would literally pull out their wallet and pay $10,000 for. That's what you're looking for, okay? So make sure that you come up with a clear problem for your ideal client. The other thing that I want you to get is that, before we move on to the third step, is that the first step, the ideal client or egoic label, and the second step, the number one problem, they're tied together. What I mean by that is that when you say coaches, specifically multi-talented coaches in my case, and you say standing out in an oversaturated space, there's a link between that problem and that ideal client. It actually makes sense based on that ideal client, right? Here's another example. Let's say you said, you know how many busy executives struggle with burnout. It would be like kind of clear, like you might be like, okay, I can make the logic jump that because they're executives, they work hard and therefore they're burned out. But it's a little bit of a mismatch because, like I said, it's a leap of logic. I'm not 100% sure why they burn out. It's not really stated inside of that egoic label. So what would make more sense is if you said something like, you know how many busy working moms struggle with burnout. Busy working moms struggling with burnout. Can you see the tie between those two? It's kind of like the acid test. If you've really got something that makes sense, it should be that no matter what industry I'm in, if I'm listening to to your first two steps here, that I should be able to say, yeah, that makes sense based on just the basic concept of who your ideal client is and what that problem is. You might be saying, well, why do coaches automatically have the issue of standing out? Well, if you know anything about the coaching space, you know that there's coaches everywhere, and there's so many people screaming to get their marketing seen, right? You just have to just be on Facebook just to see it, and it's everywhere. So it's tied together very clearly, all right? So make sure that those are tied together, okay? Let's move on to the third piece. The third piece is, well, what I do is, and this is the number one solution, okay? Now, what I want you to get, first of all, is that you don't want to get too creative. The solution is the opposite of the problem. They're two sides of the same coin. So just look at what your problem is, and then you want to frame it in the positive solution language that your ideal client wants, all right? And I'll explain one more roadblock to avoid in a moment, but let me give you my example continuing. So you know how many multi-talented coaches struggle with standing out in an oversaturated marketplace? Well, what I do is help them become category leaders, okay? What I do is help them become category leaders. So the problem was they're not standing out in an oversaturated space, and the solution was category leadership in a sense, right? And so those are two sides of the same coin. But what I didn't do, you'll notice, is I didn't say, they struggle with not standing out in an oversaturated market space, and what I do is help them stand out. You want to use language that is not just the opposite language, but is another way to state it. But even more specifically are the words that your ideal client uses. So my ideal client uses that they don't stand out, right, in an oversaturated space. And they would use the term category leader. They want to be a category leader, okay? So that is my example of step number 3. And so one quick roadblock to avoid here, like I said I was going to share. Make sure that you don't talk about process. Sometimes because the word I is here, a lot of times my clients will get into kind of their unique process. So they might say, what I do is take you through the rapid growth process that helps you do X, Y, and Z. Whatever that process is, cut that out if you find yourself writing that, and just cut to the X, Y, Z. So it's like, well, what I do is help them with the rapid shift growth 7-step process, right? It's usually wordy and unnecessary language there, which helps them to find their true calling. Let's say that was what it was. So you just cut to, well, what I do is help them find their true calling, right? That's really important. Moving on to the last piece, step number 4, so that blank, so that represents the long-term aspiration, right? So this is kind of the deeper why or motivation for your ideal client to solve this problem and get this solution. So let's go back to the top so you can see mine. You know how many multi-talented coaches struggle with standing out in an oversaturated marketplace? Well, what I do is help them become category leaders so that they can build a lucrative and leveraged business around their core gifts. Again, my last one was so that they can build a lucrative and leveraged business around their core gifts. The thing I want you to get about this piece is it's long-term, right? It's what they really are driven. They want to build a lucrative and leveraged business around their core gifts. That's what we do at Rock Your Gift. However, that is deeper than just this particular problem of standing out. Wouldn't you agree? So this piece is really more meaty, and it's kind of the longer term thing. But the thing that I see a lot of people get wrong with this particular piece is that they end up putting in a lot of internal language, like so that they can feel inner peace, or so that they can feel happiness or true fulfillment. And that stuff is just not external enough. So when I say a lucrative and leveraged business around their core gifts, you can picture that. That is the standout statement. That is my example. So what I want you to do now is just knock this out. Get it done to the best of your abilities. Don't overthink it, right? Don't get stumped. If you've done this work before, you can bring in some of that. If you've never done this before, then just take hunches and guesses. Just do your very best based on the guidelines that I laid out in this.